Many critics believe that there are two natural locations for mystery and suspense fiction, the locked room and the city. But in addition to these two classic settings, there is a range of other possibilities that for the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to describe as cozy spaces. To help us better understand the qualities that define cozy spaces, it's helpful to get a sense of what we mean by cozy mysteries. Initially identified with the golden age of British detective fiction, cozy mysteries were seen as the antithesis of hard-boiled American mysteries. Unlike their American counterparts, cozy mysteries feature amateur rather than professional criminals, amateur detectives rather than tough private eyes, relatively small and restrained amounts of violence rather than a constant stream of death, one or sometimes two murders are the rule, frequently unusual and even exotic murder weapons, poison is a popular choice, rather than guns or fists, and usually a small group of characters who form a limited number of suspects. In general, cozy mysteries emphatically reject the cities explored by hard-boiled mysteries and instead prefer non-urban settings. In this lecture, we shall look at three such settings: the country house, the village, and the suburb. What they all have in common is that they're spaces where crime is not meant to occur. So, theoretically speaking, when crime and violence do erupt in one of these cozy spaces, the reader is meant to be shocked and to yearn for the restoration of order brought about by the detective. In practice, the cozy spaces of mystery and suspense fiction are defined by a contradiction. Even though they're meant to be free of violence, their long-standing popularity in the genre means that they're just as blood-soaked as the mean streets from which they theoretically differ. What is the impact of this contradiction for both the past and the future of cozy spaces in mystery and suspense fiction? In The Guilty Vicarage, a hugely influential essay by the English poet W.H. Auden that was first published in 1948, Auden describes what he sees as the necessary elements for an effective detective story. Among his observations are that the victim must be good enough for the reader to care about who killed him, and bad enough for multiple suspects to have a plausible motive for killing him. Auden also remarks on the desirability of basically good and ethical characters. A detective who exists in a state of grace so that he can restore a society disturbed by murder back to its previous peaceful state, and a society in which an act of violence is shocking because it's out of place. In Auden's words, the corpse must shock not only because it's a corpse, but also because, even for a corpse, it is shockingly out of place, as when a dog makes a mess on a drawing room carpet. For our purposes, Auden is especially helpful when he describes the type of space that defines an effective detective story. In particular, his stipulation that detective stories should be set in both a closed society and a closely related society indicates that, for Auden, the detective story from a spatial point of view is essentially a cozy phenomenon. As Auden elaborates, such conditions are met by A, the group of blood relatives, the Christmas dinner and the country house, B, the closely knit geographical group, the old world village, C, the occupational group, the theatrical company, and D, the group isolated by the neutral place, the Pullman car. Let's look more closely at the country house mystery to see why Auden's recommendations make so much sense and how mystery writers have used the country house as a setting. Like the locked room mystery, many mystery and suspense fiction writers have tried their hand at the country house mystery, including Marjorie Allingham in The Beckoning Lady, A.A. Milne in The Red House Mystery, Michael Innes in Hamlet Revenge, and Nio Marsh in Death and the Dancing Footman. Despite all of these worthy contenders, the undisputed champion of this type of mystery is Agatha Christie, who wrote some of the best country house mysteries ever, including her very first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, published in 1920. The novel establishes many of the features of the country house mystery that Christie would return to throughout her career in such novels as The Body in the Library, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and Curtain, in which Christie returns to the country house setting for her last novel featuring Hercule Poirot, some 55 years after first using this combination in Styles. Apart from the presence of the brilliant amateur detective in the form of Poirot, the other important attributes of Styles that help define the country house mystery include the setting, Styles Manor in Essex, the family, the Cavendishes, who together with the servants and the family friends form a small, closed community of characters and suspects, and the motive, a combination of greed and family intrigue. Christie and other writers of this type of mystery usually combine these attributes in such a way that the country house mystery bears more than a passing resemblance to the locked room mystery. In some cases, the murder may take place in a locked room inside the country house, but even if this element is not present, both types tend to include maps, diagrams, and floor plans, obsessive attention to the temporal and spatial location of each character at crucial moments, an abundance of red herrings, and the detective's triumphant unveiling of the murderer at the end of the tale. Thanks to these similarities, country house mysteries, like their locked room counterparts, have tended to be an easy target for criticism because of what is taken to be their artificiality, their lack of realism, their insularity, and their very limited portrayal of the society outside of the small, closed circle of characters that the reader is meant to stay focused on. Raymond Chandler is absolutely withering about this type of mystery in his essay, The Simple Art of Murder, although he does admit to preferring the English variety to its American cousin. Why? Chandler explains, "The English may not always be the best writers in the world, but they are incomparably the best dull writers." Ouch. Because country house mysteries are so carefully structured and adhere to what seems like a very restrictive set of genre conventions, they're also very easy to satirize. In his one-act play, The Real Inspector Hound, for example, British playwright Tom Stoppard produces a brilliantly funny send-up of the country house mystery, in which two theatre critics, Moon and Birdboot, who are watching a theatrical production of a country house mystery, find themselves unexpectedly involved in the play and in solving the mystery. In the process, Stoppard satirizes the typical setting of the country house, the various character types involved, and the extremely unlikely resolution of the tangled plot threads. The problem with both the critiques and the satires of the country house mystery is that none of them really grapple with the question of why this form is so successful and enduring. Country house mysteries are still published in great quantities today. Readers are clearly not bothered by the artificiality of this form because they don't read country house mysteries for their realism. Instead, they read them for the intellectual exercise, the effort to solve the challenge posed to them by the writer, and the pleasure of seeing a tangled skein of circumstances resolved into a simplicity that sees the guilty punished, the innocent saved, and order restored. What part does the cozy setting play in the popularity of the country house mystery? Again, the reader should be given credit for recognizing the artificiality of the setting. including the absurdity of claiming that this space is by definition so free of violence that a murder taking place in its midst is a shock. Nevertheless, the reader does respond to seeing the coziness of the setting, no matter how artificial it is, disturbed by murder and its attendant disruptive impact. Consequently, no matter how ritualized, not to mention temporary, the detective's restoration of order might be, it still functions as a satisfactory resolution to the mystery. We can make very much the same points about mysteries set in country villages, as opposed to country houses. Just as the country house can be read as a larger version of the locked room, so the village can be read as a larger version of the country house. Accordingly, all the same criticisms that are made of country house mysteries, their artificiality, their lack of realism, and so on, have also been made of village mysteries. And again, these criticisms, although they may be accurate in a limited sense, are also guilty of missing the point. Mysteries set in cozy villages are popular not in spite of the fact that they're artificial, but because they're artificial. These cozy settings allow readers to engage with gory subjects such as murder in a context that's safe and reassuring in ways that mysteries set in contemporary cities may not be. Village mysteries also introduce an important new dimension to what I would describe as the democratization of mystery and suspense fiction. And this makes them a very important part of the genre. Not surprisingly, Agatha Christie is also the queen of the village mystery. And in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we see that Poirot quickly realizes that if he's going to solve the case, he needs to pay close attention to Caroline Shepherd. Caroline is a village gossip who's routinely ignored by her brother, Dr. Shepherd. But Poirot recognizes that she and her friends are a valuable source of information because they know more about the ins and outs of village life than anyone else. We see the same emphasis on what we might call informal kinds of knowledge in Christie's Miss Marple novels. Set in the fictional village of St. Mary Mead, this series began with the publication of The Murder at the Vicarage in 1930. Although others frequently dismiss her as a gossip and a busybody, Miss Marple again and again demonstrates her ability to solve the most puzzling mysteries through her gifts of observation, listening, and knowing everything that goes on in St. Mary Mead. When judged against the background of the earliest master detectives like Dupin, Holmes, and Poirot, who are all male, Christie's amateur female sleuth is enormously significant because she depends on different, more populist and informal modes of knowledge and analysis, such as gossip rather than science. As such, Miss Marple suggests one reason why cozy settings tend to be used overwhelmingly by female rather than male mystery and suspense fiction writers. Coziness gives these female writers an opportunity to both explore and deconstruct the status of women in the genre as a whole, and in doing so, they innovate the genre dramatically. This is true not only in country house and village mysteries, but also in more contemporary texts set in the suburbs. Until quite recently, the concept of suburban mystery and suspense fiction would have seemed like a contradiction in terms. Today, the situation is very different. Thanks to the game-changing success of such novels as Gillian Flynn's 2012 bestseller Gone Girl, the suburbs are more visible and viable than ever among writers and readers of the genre. Any discussion of how the genre draws upon the suburban must begin with the work of Patricia Highsmith, the godmother of suburban mystery fiction. Highsmith was one of the first writers in the genre to set her work consistently in small towns and suburbs, and to explore systematically the possibilities of those environments for mystery fiction. In some of her novels, such as The Cry of the Owl and Edith's Diary, her protagonists are recent arrivals from the city. In other novels, such as Deep Water, the characters are dyed-in-the-wool suburbanites, and the stories revolve around showing the reader what lies beneath the surface of this apparently cozy and mundane setting. What was it that attracted Highsmith to the suburbs as a setting? The answer, I think, can be found in a remark she makes in her how-to book, Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction, when she describes one of her main themes as showing the American's everyday or garden variety of schizophrenia. Given this theme, the suburbs are a logical choice of setting for Highsmith's work. What better place to explore the gap between American fantasy and reality than in a space that represents both the ideal of the American dream and the reality of American nightmares? We can see exactly how Highsmith exposes the reality of the seemingly cozy space of the suburbs by looking more closely at Deep Water, whose protagonist, Vic Van Allen, is a good example of one of Highsmith's most frequent, innovative, and influential character types, the likable psychopath. Vic is generous and kind, has harmless hobbies, and is very patient with his wife Melinda's infidelities. It's this patience that earns the admiration of his friends and associates in the small town of Little Wesley. As the novel progresses, however, Highsmith shows us that beneath Vic's placid surface, there's a great deal of anger and shame. In this respect, Vic can be read as a personification of the suburbs themselves, with the threat of violence hiding underneath an apparently calm surface. The first time this hidden side of Vic comes out is when he warns off one of Melinda's admirers by telling him that he has killed a man and would be willing to do so again. Strangely enough, Vic's claim to have killed meets with the approval of his friends, who presumably admire the fact that he's finally stood up for himself and objected to his wife's philandering. In a novel that's so concerned with conformity, the idea that Vic conforms precisely by claiming to be a murderer suggests that Highsmith considers the threat of violence to be the norm of suburban life, rather than the exception. The impression that the suburbs approve of violence is strengthened when it's revealed that Vic was lying about having killed. In the face of this second revelation, Vic is embarrassed because he knows that people will lose respect for him and that Melinda's affairs will continue. It's against this background that Vic becomes a murderer in fact, rather than in fantasy when he kills Melinda's current lover, Charlie Delisle. After the murder, Vic is described as feeling more relaxed now, and to be perfectly honest, happier. He couldn't see himself as a criminal, a psychopath. And Highsmith's reader is tempted to ask, why should Vic think of himself as a psychopath? After all, in murdering Delisle, wasn't Vic just actualizing a form of behavior he knew his fellow suburbanites endorsed? The reader's feeling that the community is solidly behind Vic increases when he commits a second murder and is investigated by a private detective. The community refuses to cooperate with the detective, despite thinking that Vic may in fact have committed murder. Even though Vic is eventually arrested for the murder, we can never quite shake the sense that the community approves of Vic's violence. Indeed, although Vic prides himself on being a nonconformist, we can argue that not only is he a conformist, but also it's precisely his violence that makes him conform to the suburban ethic. In its emphasis on exposing the apparent quietness and coziness of suburban life and revealing the turmoil underneath, as well as in its focus on family, male-female relations, and gender roles, Highsmith's work provides a template for later examples of suburban crime fiction to model itself upon. If we now turn to Gillian Flynn's blockbuster success Gone Girl, we'll see that in many ways it reads like an updated version of Patricia Highsmith. The story revolves around the apparently ideal suburban couple, Nick and Amy Dunn. When Amy finds out about Nick's infidelity, she fakes her death in an attempt to frame Nick for her apparent murder. She eventually returns and is reunited with Nick, but only because it suits her purposes. Just like Highsmith's, Flynn's story has a deeply pessimistic view of marriage and male-female relations. Just like Highsmith, Flynn is interested in how gender roles dictate the lives of people in ways they can't control, sometimes because they aren't even aware of them. And just like in Highsmith, the suburbs are the logical setting for Flynn's portrayal of a decaying marriage. What better place to present the bitterness of failure and the viciousness of mutual hatred than in the space traditionally occupied by people who have achieved the American dream? In fact, in some ways, Flynn goes even further than Highsmith. Although in Deep Water, the conflict between husband and wife ends with Melinda's murder, Flynn decides to keep her happy couple alive and together at the end of her novel. To the outside world, they're a success story. A husband and wife who were cruelly parted when Amy was apparently abducted and who are now joyfully reunited. The reader knows the truth, however. Nick and Amy are indeed bound more closely together than ever before, but by fear and hate rather than love. In Nick's words, me, Nick Dunn, the man who used to forget so many details, is now the guy who replays conversations to make sure I didn't offend, to make sure I never hurt her feelings. I am a great husband because I am very afraid she may kill me. It's difficult to imagine a more effective deconstruction and critique of the ideal of cozy suburban happiness. Anyone who has read and enjoyed the work of Gillian Flynn should also explore the work of Megan Abbott, because in my opinion, she's writing the most innovative and interesting suburban mystery fiction today. She began her career by writing a series of novels, starting with Die a Little, that reimagined classic noir narratives from a female perspective. Beginning in 2011, with The End of Everything, however, Abbott's work underwent a very pronounced shift that continued in her next two novels, Dare Me and The Fever. Her settings became more contemporary, any element of pastiche of classic noir was eliminated, suburbs replaced cities, and the nature of her protagonist changed dramatically. In fact, these three novels could be considered a trilogy in the sense that they, like Flynn's Gone Girl, all share what I would describe as an implicit use of their suburban settings. In other words, Abbott's subject is not the suburbs per se. Instead, she uses the suburbs as the necessary setting for the subjects and themes she's most interested in. But more importantly, these novels also share a common type of protagonist that makes them particularly innovative in the context of suburban mystery fiction: teenage girls. The End of Everything, for example, focuses on the friendship of two 13-year-old girls, Lizzie and Evie, who are growing up as next-door neighbors in a placid 1980s Midwestern suburb. As befits their age, the majority of the novel's scenes take place in the girls' houses and their backyards. The narrative is defined by both what Lizzie and Evie perceive as the limitations of their present situations, as well as the tantalizing possibilities of the future. Although Lizzie is as devastated as everyone else when Evie is abducted, she also takes the opportunity to develop an increasingly sexualized connection with Evie's father, something she's clearly desired but also disavowed for some time. After Evie is returned by her abductor, weighed down by what she's been through, it precipitates a crisis not only in the formerly close relationship between Lizzie and Evie, but also in Lizzie's belief in Evie's family as an ideal. Lizzie has now been shut out from a family that she can no longer pretend is perfect, but that she still identifies with and that she still desperately wants to belong to. The desire to belong is also an important theme in Dare Me, which is set in the competitive, even brutal world of high school cheerleading. Like Evie in The End of Everything, Abbott's protagonist, Addie Hanlon, is enmeshed in a complex relationship with her best friend, in this case, Beth Cassidy, a fellow cheerleader. And just as the girls circle around Mr. Verver in The End of Everything, in Dare Me, there's also fierce competition for the attention of an adult, the new cheerleading coach, Coach French. Where the two novels differ from each other, however, is in terms of their suburban geography. Although neither novel is interested in mapping out the topography of the typical American suburb, Dare Me offers the readers a vision of suburban space that reflects both the experiences and the desires of these high school girls. Moving away from the bedrooms and backyards of The End of Everything and their admittedly fragile coziness, Dare Me dispenses with the illusion of coziness altogether by showing its reader the seedier side of the suburbs, because from Abbott's point of view, sexual activity, both actual and fantasized, defines the high school girl's vision of suburban space. The space that looms largest for the cheerleader protagonists of Dare Me is the high school. Abbott has commented that high school is the ultimate noir terrain, and she proves it in this novel. The high school is the space where the most intense dramas get played out and where the violence of these teenage relationships is displayed in all of its glorious and hyperbolic fury. Although there is a murder in Dare Me, its solution takes a back seat to the relationship between Addie and Beth, which not only remains Abbott's focus from start to finish, but also defines the representation of suburban space in the novel, a space that both defines and in some ways confines these characters. Is there any escape from the suburbs for Abbott's characters? She suggests an answer to this question in The Fever, where the space of phone messages, texting, Snapchat, Instagram, and YouTube clips is often even more important than the suburban town occupied by its characters. This is not to say that built space is completely irrelevant in the novel. When one teenage girl after another succumbs to a mysterious plague of seizures at the local high school, various theories are proposed to explain the events. These theories allow Abbott to explore some particular locations in the community, including the high school playing field, which may or may not be hazardous to the students' health, and a mysterious neo-Gothic dying lake on the edge of town, where some of the students may have gone swimming. Moreover, the high school itself is just as important in The Fever as it is in Dare Me, and it's clear that both the rumor mill and the level of hysteria generated by the mysterious illnesses are exacerbated by the smallness of the town where the action takes place. And yet, despite all this, Abbott brilliantly conveys the extent to which the teenage girls in The Fever live their lives in virtual space, just as much as geographical, particularly suburban space. She also shows how this virtual space constitutes a new type of cozy space, albeit one fraught with tension. Social media is the main way these girls communicate with each other, spread rumors about each other, fight with each other, and attack each other. Given the dominance of cyberspace in the lives and identities of these characters, we might be tempted to ask how important the suburban space they live in really is to the action of the novel. Abbott's writing the best suburban mystery fiction around today, but in doing so, she may also have exhausted the genre by rendering the suburbs irrelevant. Still, I want to emphasize that there are other possible future directions for the suburb in particular, and for cozy spaces in general in mystery and suspense fiction. The first direction is based on the fact that the assumption in practically all the works I've discussed that suburban nights are all white and middle class is never seriously challenged. Given that suburbs in the real world are becoming more ethnically and racially diverse, suburban mystery fiction needs to diversify. In doing so, the genre can reflect both how some people in the suburbs may indeed have a legitimate reason to be fearful, and that those people may include individuals who are not white and middle class. The second future direction has to do with the fact that most suburban mystery fiction, with the partial exception of Gillian Flynn, still treats the suburbs as a place of middle-class affluence. In fact, American suburbs are changing rapidly in terms of both class and economic prosperity. So, it's hard to ignore the possibility that in terms of mystery and suspense fiction, we're witnessing a process in which the gap between Chandler's famous mean streets and the streets of suburbia is getting more and more narrow. The third and final future direction involves acknowledging that most contemporary writers in the genre continue to treat violent crime in the suburbs as exceptional. In fact, suburban crime rates are rising rapidly at a time when urban crime is declining. If suburban mystery fiction were more attuned to changes taking place in today's suburbs and paid more attention to the poor and the victimized in suburban spaces, it's possible that the exploration of the contradictory nature of cozy spaces could continue to take the genre as a whole in unanticipated and daring new directions. In fact, the suburb has the potential to make mystery and suspense fiction face up to the fact that we may, in the 21st century, have run out of cozy spaces altogether.